You spent 8 hours calculating that shot, and the wind changed its mind in 8 seconds. The remark drifted across the firing line so quietly that at first nobody was sure who had said it. Then every head turned toward the chain-link fence bordering Camp Hawthorne's long-range sniper range. The afternoon sun shimmered above the dry earth. Heat waves twisted over the distant hills like transparent ribbons. A row of range flags snapped and fluttered under an unpredictable crosswind. Beyond them, more than 2,000 yards away, a steel silhouette stood untouched beneath the bright summer sky. Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Mercer lowered his spotting scope and rubbed a hand across his jaw. His patience had evaporated hours ago. Around him, the Marine sniper team looked equally frustrated. Advanced ballistic calculators sat on folding tables. Wind meters hung from gear bags. Tablets displayed firing solutions precise to the decimal. Everything said the shot should work. Yet every round landed somewhere other than where it was supposed to. The steel target remained silent, untouched, unimpressed. Mercer exhaled sharply and glanced toward the observation platform where visiting officers watched from the shade. This was supposed to be a demonstration. Instead, it was becoming an embarrassment. Reset for another attempt, he ordered. The team moved quickly, professional, disciplined. But beneath the routine, tension was beginning to spread. The kind that settled into shoulders and tightened voices. The kind that appeared when highly trained people started questioning equipment they trusted. One sniper checked his data again. Another recalculated atmospheric conditions. A third adjusted his optic and stared through the glass as though determination alone could bend the bullet's path. Then the voice came again. You're solving the wrong problem. This time, everyone heard it. Mercer turned fully. Standing outside the fence was an old man carrying a worn canvas rifle case over one shoulder. He looked completely out of place. His faded green jacket had seen better decades. His jeans were dusty. His white hair moved gently in the breeze. Yet there was something oddly steady about him. While everyone else seemed irritated by the wind, he appeared to be listening to it. "Excuse me," Mercer called. The old man nodded toward the distant target. "You're reading the flag nearest the firing line." His voice was calm, matter of fact. "The bullet doesn't spend much time there. It spends most of its flight crossing those ridges." He pointed toward the rolling terrain between the shooters and the target. 3 different winds, 3 different temperatures, 3 different stories. A few Marines exchanged amused looks. One of them chuckled. Another shook his head. Mercer folded his arms. "And who exactly are you?" The old man offered a small shrug. "Just someone watching." The answer earned another round of laughter. Mercer glanced at the rifle case. "Watching from outside the fence." "That's right. Then keep watching." The gunnery sergeant turned away. "We've got this handled." The old man simply nodded. No argument. No wounded pride. He shifted his gaze back toward the distant hills, toward the moving grass, toward the invisible currents drifting across the valley. Behind him, another shot cracked through the afternoon air. Everyone watched. Everyone waited. Seconds later, the spotter's voice broke the silence. Mississippi, the range fell quiet again. And for the first time all day, the old man's expression changed. Not into a smile, not into a smirk, just the faintest hint of recognition, as though he had seen this exact scene play out many years before. The heat of the afternoon pressed down across the long-range sniper course, the sun bending the light into hazy waves that danced over the dry dirt. Walter Hayes remained outside the fence, his hands resting on the worn canvas case slung over his shoulder. He did not move hastily, did not speak louder than necessary, yet every eye on the line seemed drawn to him. Inside the firing lane, Gunnery Sergeant Mercer adjusted his spotting scope, his patience thinning with each missed round. He had hoped that careful calculations and the most advanced equipment the base could offer would make this a demonstration of precision and skill. Instead, frustration thickened the air, making every breath feel heavier. One of the snipers, Lance Corporal Evans, swiveled to glance at Walter. Curiosity piqued despite the disdain etched across his young face. "He does not belong here," Mercer muttered under his breath. The old man simply nodded toward the distant hills, eyes steady and focused. A faint wind stirred the grass along the ridges, shifting in ways the sensors and computers could not measure. Walter lifted a hand slowly, pointing to the subtle flutter of a flag far across the valley. "That one," he said softly. "It tells more than your instruments can." It shows the movement, the change. The air is not constant. The bullet will not travel the path you think. A ripple of amusement passed through the younger Marines. They laughed quietly, exchanging glances, convinced the old man was making fanciful claims. Mercer clenched his jaw, a frown tightening the lines on his weathered face. If he is so wise, let him prove it, Mercer finally said, his tone controlled but sharp. Walter did not step forward immediately. He studied the terrain, the flags, the shifting heat waves, and the distant target. He did not rely on any device, did not pull out a tablet or glance at ballistic charts. Instead, his gaze followed the subtle motion of the foliage, the way the wind bent the dry grass, the way the sunlight reflected off the target from 100 angles. Another Marine fired a round. It missed again. The quiet statement from Walter lingered in the air, unassuming yet filled with weight. You are reading the wrong currents. See how they interact across the ridges. Each path tells a story you have ignored. Mercer watched closely, the tension between skepticism and curiosity coiling tight among the team. Walter slowly placed the canvas case on the ground, unzipped it, and lifted out a rifle, aged and marked with decades of careful use. He did not rush. He did not announce his intent. The older Marines on the line exchanged subtle nods, sensing something unusual in the calm determination of this man. The younger snipers leaned forward, half in mockery, half in intrigue, as Walter adjusted the rifle, aligning it with a measured steadiness that belied his years. He took a moment, breathing in the dry air, letting the movement of the valley dictate his posture, his sighting, his understanding of a shot no one had been able to make all afternoon. The wind gusted again, bending flags and dust, but Walter's eyes did not waver. A subtle click, a soft adjustment, a glance at the distant steel target, and the tension on the line became almost tangible, as if time itself paused to watch. The range had grown unusually quiet. Even the laughter that had followed Walter Hayes a few minutes earlier had faded into uneasy silence. The old man remained kneeling behind the rifle, his weathered hands resting lightly against the stock as though he had known it for most of his life. Around him, Marines who normally carried themselves with effortless confidence now watched with cautious curiosity. Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Mercer folded his arms and stepped closer. You still have not answered my question, he said. What exactly makes you think you understand this range better than the people trained to work here? Walter did not immediately look up. His eyes remained fixed on the distant ridgeline. The wind shifted again. A faint current brushed across the firing line, stirring dust along the edge of the concrete pad. I never said I understood it better, Walter replied. I just said the range is talking to you, and nobody is listening. A few Marines exchanged puzzled looks. Mercer shook his head. That does not even mean anything. Walter finally looked at him. His pale blue eyes were calm, almost reflective. Sure it does. He pointed toward the valley. Look at the grass halfway down that slope. Then look at the brush near the creek bed. Then watch the flag near the target. Several heads turned automatically. The grass leaned one direction. The brush moved another. The distant flag snapped at an entirely different angle. Mercer frowned. He had noticed the movement before, but only as background noise. Walter seemed to be studying it like a language. Wind is not one thing, Walter continued quietly. People treat it like one number, one calculation. Out there, it becomes dozens of small decisions. The old man reached toward the rifle and carefully turned it sideways. The afternoon sunlight caught a long scar running across the walnut stalk. It was not damage from neglect. It looked older than that. Purposeful, carried through years of use. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks noticed it immediately. Something about the mark felt strangely familiar. He had seen photographs in the base archive during a historical presentation months ago. The memory tugged at him, faint and distant. Mercer noticed Ethan staring. What? He asked. Ethan hesitated. Nothing, Gunny. But it was not nothing. The shape of that gouge. The age of the rifle. The quiet confidence of the old man. Pieces were beginning to connect somewhere in the back of his mind. Walter lifted the rifle slightly and brushed dust from the stock with his sleeve. The gesture was small, almost affectionate. For a brief moment, his expression softened. Not with pride, with memory. The range disappeared from his eyes. The noise of the Marines faded. Somewhere deep behind those pale blue eyes lived another landscape entirely. Then it was gone. He blinked once and returned to the present. That rifle must be older than everyone standing here, one Marine joked. A few chuckles followed. Walter nodded. Probably. Still works? Another asked. Walter glanced down at it. Never gave me a reason to doubt it. Mercer rolled his eyes. Well, that makes one of us. More laughter followed, but this time it sounded forced. Ethan continued staring at the scar in the stock. His pulse had quickened. Suddenly he remembered where he had seen it. A black and white photograph hanging in a forgotten hallway near the armory. A legendary marksman standing beside a weathered rifle. The same scar. The same mark. Ethan felt a chill despite the heat. He looked from the rifle to Walter Hayes and back again. For the first time all afternoon, he was no longer wondering whether the old man could make the shot. He was beginning to wonder who Walter Hayes really was. Walter Hayes adjusted the rifle slightly, the wood smooth and worn, polished from decades of careful handling. He did not rush, did not flinch under the curious eyes of the Marines watching from the firing line. The sun had moved higher, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt and patches of dry grass between the shooting stations. The flags along the ridges whipped violently with each passing gust, yet Walter's gaze remained steady. He bent his knees slightly, feeling the subtle pressure of the wind against his face, noting the direction of each subtle change. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks continued to observe him from behind, his hands resting lightly on the edge of his spotting scope, jaw tight with anticipation. A quiet tension had fallen over the range. The usual chatter and mechanical clicks of digital equipment now hushed as everyone sensed something unusual about the calm confidence of the old man. He is taking his time, Mercer muttered under his breath, frustration and curiosity mingling in his voice. Walter lifted the rifle to his shoulder, aligning it with the distant target, and for a brief second the world seemed to slow. The hum of the distant highway, the whisper of the flags, the rustling of dry leaves along the slope, all merged into a rhythm he could read, a pattern invisible to the trained technology of the younger Marines. He exhaled gently, letting the rifle settle into place as if the weapon were an extension of his own instincts. Each subtle adjustment of his hands, each shift in weight, was deliberate, calculated by experience rather than numbers. Ethan could not tear his eyes away from the faint scar on the rifle stock, etched into the walnut by a lifetime of precision and care. Memories seemed to hover in the air around Walter, silent yet potent, hinting at decades of lessons learned and victories earned in quiet moments away from the eyes of the world. Mercer frowned again, squinting against the sun. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, though there was a note of uncertainty now. Walter's calm presence had unsettled the Marines more than any display of arrogance ever could. Even the youngest sniper on the line seemed to feel the weight of history pressing down, the quiet authority that came not from rank or technology, but from a lifetime of measured decisions and careful observation. A light breeze stirred, carrying dust across the pad, and Walter tilted his head, watching it interact with the flags and foliage in the valley. He adjusted his aim minutely, not a single motion wasted, every movement speaking of familiarity and understanding. Ethan inhaled sharply. He had seen veterans before, but never one who could seem to read the environment so completely, to anticipate it before it moved. Walter's lips pressed into a line, his focus unbroken, as if the entire range had narrowed down to that single steel target 2,000 yards away. Mercer's impatience had not lessened, but even he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a quiet acknowledgment that this man, despite age and appearance, held a presence that commanded attention. The rifles of the younger Marines rested uneasy in their hands, the machines and digital aids unable to replicate the sense of judgment and experience Walter exuded. And for a moment, even the wind seemed to wait, the flags pausing mid-flutter as if holding their breath for what was about to come. Walter Hayes remained motionless behind the rifle, but his fingers drifted briefly across the scar carved into the walnut stock. The touch was light, almost absent-minded, yet the moment his skin met the worn groove, something distant stirred behind his eyes. The bright afternoon at Camp Hawthorne faded beneath the weight of memory. The dry heat of the range gave way to a humid wind carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. Decades earlier, Walter had stood on a ridgeline far from home, a young Marine with steady hands and a borrowed rifle that already looked old even then. The world had felt larger in those days, wilder, less predictable. He remembered endless green hills rolling beneath low clouds and the constant challenge of reading terrain that seemed alive. The rifle had rested against his shoulder exactly as it did now, not as a weapon, as a trusted companion, a tool that rewarded patience and punished ego. Back then, there had been no digital weather stations, no ballistic computers, no screens glowing with perfect calculations. There had only been observation, experience, and judgment. Walter remembered an older staff sergeant kneeling beside him during a long training exercise, pointing toward a distant valley. The man had spoken quietly, almost like a teacher sharing a secret. "The wind never lies," he had said. "People do. Instruments do. Assumptions do. But the wind tells the truth if you learn how to listen." Walter had carried those words through every year that followed. He remembered studying the movement of grass across open hillsides, watching birds adjust their flight, learning to recognize invisible currents from the way leaves trembled on distant branches. The lessons had taken years, thousands of hours, more failures than successes. Yet eventually something changed. The environment stopped looking random. Patterns emerged. Connections appeared. Every ridge, every valley, every patch of sunlight began telling part of the same story. The scar on the rifle stock came from one of those lessons. During a difficult field exercise many years ago, Walter had slipped while crossing a rocky slope. The rifle had struck exposed stone, leaving a deep gouge along the wood. He had stared at the damage with frustration, convinced he had ruined something irreplaceable. The staff sergeant had simply laughed. "Now it has character," he had said. "A perfect rifle has never taught anybody anything." The memory lingered. Walter could still hear the man's voice despite the decades separating them. He could still remember the confidence it had given him. The lesson had never been about marksmanship alone. It had been about humility, about understanding that nature could not be conquered, only respected. The memory slowly dissolved. The humid air vanished. The green hills disappeared. Walter found himself once again beneath the bright sky of Camp Hawthorne. The range returned. The distant steel target waited across the valley. Around him, Marines stood watching in complete silence. None of them knew where his thoughts had traveled during those few seconds. None of them understood that the scar in the rifle represented far more than age. It represented a lifetime spent learning lessons no classroom could teach. Walter drew a slow breath and settled behind the stock once more. The wind brushed across his cheek. The flags fluttered along the ridgelines. The grass bent and recovered. And for the first time that afternoon, Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks was no longer looking at an old man carrying an outdated rifle. He was looking at someone whose experience seemed deeper than anything written in the manual stacked inside the training center. The quiet stretched across the range, broken only by the occasional shuffle of boots and the distant hum of the highway. Walter Hayes adjusted his stance, his back straight and steady as he measured the unseen currents between the firing line and the target. Every flag along the ridges twitched, yet to Walter they formed a coherent language, telling him exactly how each gust would influence the flight of a single bullet. Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks could hardly breathe without feeling the weight of anticipation. He had studied marksmanship for years, had spent countless hours on the range, but nothing had ever made him feel quite like this. Walter's fingers rested lightly on the bolt, feeling its age, its balance, the subtle play of the stock in his hands. The scar along the wood seemed almost to pulse beneath his touch, a remnant of a lifetime of lessons, each groove telling a story of precision, patience, and careful observation. Mercer moved closer, his voice low but tense. "You really think you can make it?" Walter did not answer immediately. He did not need to. His eyes scanned the landscape, noting the smallest shifts in sunlight across the target and the subtle bends of the grass along the slope. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the dry, warm air. Each element of the environment spoke to him, not in words, but in patterns, rhythms, and cues he had learned to read over decades. The other Marines shifted uneasily. The digital aids, the tablets, the wind meters, everything they had relied upon all morning could not replicate the knowledge etched into Walter's instincts. He lifted the rifle and settled the crosshairs over the distant steel silhouette, aligning not just with the target, but with the wind, the heat, the distance, and the subtle undulations of the valley between. Ethan could see the faint twitch of his eyes as he accounted for each element. The sun glinted off the rifle's barrel, the shadow of the stock stretching along the dry dirt. The older man's breathing was steady, controlled, measured, a rhythm that seemed to quiet the restless energy of the younger shooters. Walter exhaled slowly, letting his hands fall into position naturally. There was no hurry. There was only timing, only listening, only the complete comprehension of a system no one else could see. Mercer folded his arms, his chest rising and falling with the tension of the moment, while Ethan continued to study the faint scar and the focused gaze that accompanied it. The flags whipped once more, but Walter barely noticed. His world had narrowed to a single point, 2,050 yards away, where a steel target waited. Everything else had faded, leaving only the alignment of the rifle, the judgment of his senses, and the quiet certainty of skill honed over decades. A small breeze carried dust across the concrete, swirled in the sunlight, and then settled as if the world itself were holding its breath. Walter tightened his grip just slightly, the movement imperceptible to anyone but the closest observer. The older man exuded a calm authority, an assurance that he had walked this path before countless times and understood it better than anyone could articulate. The younger Marines felt it instinctively. Mercer, despite his confidence and years of training, felt a pang of doubt. Ethan's eyes widened. He could not explain why, but he knew, with a certainty that startled him, that Walter Hayes was about to do something extraordinary. The target, distant and small, seemed to wait along with them, a silent participant in the tension that stretched across the valley. The world had contracted into this single shot, and everyone standing on the range, even if they did not yet understand it, felt the gravity of what was about to unfold. As the silence deepened across Camp Hawthorne, Lance Corporal Ethan Brooks slowly stepped back from the firing line and reached for his phone. Nobody noticed. Every eye remained fixed on Walter Hayes and the distant steel target shimmering in the afternoon heat. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. The image from the old photograph had finally locked into place. The scar on the rifle, the posture, even the eyes. He moved behind a maintenance shed near the edge of the range and opened the base directory. His fingers hesitated for only a second before dialing the armory office. The line connected after 2 rings. Master Sergeant Cole speaking. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. Master Sergeant, this is Lance Corporal Brooks at Long Range Facility 3. I need to ask you something. The older voice sounded mildly annoyed. This better be important. Ethan swallowed. Do we have any records on a Walter Hayes? Silence. A brief pause. Then the sound of a keyboard. Walter Hayes? The Master Sergeant repeated. Why are you asking about Walter Hayes? Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The change in tone was immediate. He is here at the range. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Describe him. Ethan looked toward the firing line. White hair. Early 80s, maybe. Old green jacket. Carrying an older M40 rifle with a scar on the stock. Nothing came through the phone for several seconds. Then Ethan heard a chair scrape sharply against the floor. Stay where you are. The voice had become completely serious. Do not hang up. Ethan listened as distant voices echoed through the armory office. Drawers opened. A door closed. Someone else was called over. 30 seconds later, another voice appeared on the line. Older. More authoritative. Lance Corporal, this is Chief Warrant Officer Daniels. Repeat exactly what rifle he is carrying. Ethan described the scar again. He described the age of the weapon and Walter's appearance. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Finally, Daniels spoke. Do not interrupt him. Do not allow anyone else to interrupt him either. Ethan blinked. Sir, just listen carefully. Is he preparing to take a shot? Ethan looked toward the firing line again. Walter remained perfectly still behind the rifle. Yes, sir. Daniels exhaled slowly. Good Lord. Ethan could hear more voices gathering in the background. One question followed another. The name Walter Hayes spread through the room like a dropped stone, sending ripples across water. Within minutes, another call was placed. Then another. Information moved rapidly through channels Ethan could not see. At division headquarters, several miles away, a colonel reviewing afternoon reports suddenly paused when a familiar name crossed his desk. He looked up immediately. Walter Hayes. The question drew attention from everyone nearby. An operations officer nodded. That is the name. The colonel stood. Call the commanding general. Back at the range, none of the Marines knew what had started moving beyond their sight. Mercer certainly did not. His attention remained fixed on Walter. Yet something had changed. The atmosphere felt different now, larger somehow, as if events had quietly begun unfolding far beyond the boundaries of the range. Walter himself appeared completely unaware. Or perhaps he simply did not care. He remained focused on the valley, on the flags, on the shifting currents dancing above the ridges. The target waited in the distance. The wind whispered across the grass. And somewhere beyond Camp Hawthorne, people who had not spoken his name in years were suddenly standing up from their desks. The valley seemed impossibly still. Even the wind, which had spent the entire afternoon dancing across the ridgelines, appeared to hesitate. Walter Hayes remained behind the rifle, his focus absolute. Around him, Marines who had arrived that morning with complete confidence now stood silent, their attention fixed on the old man and the distant target more than 2,000 yards away. Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Mercer no longer looked irritated. He looked uncertain. That feeling only deepened when Walter slowly lowered the rifle and glanced toward the hills. "Move the target," he said calmly. Several Marines exchanged confused looks. "Move it where?" Mercer asked. Walter pointed farther downrange. Beyond the existing steel silhouette sat another target position rarely used during standard qualification exercises. The distance marker beside it read 2,300 yards. Mercer stared at him. "You want the farther target?" Walter nodded. "The wind is cleaner there." A few nervous laughs escaped the younger Marines. Nobody else joined them. Something about the old man's certainty made the joke feel inappropriate. After a long pause, Mercer motioned for the range crew to reposition the exercise. Radios crackled. A utility vehicle moved slowly across the distant terrain. The steel silhouette was relocated. The new target appeared almost impossibly small against the landscape. Through the naked eye, it looked no larger than a thumbnail held at arm's length. Walter watched the entire process without saying another word. He simply observed the valley, the ridges, the movement of sunlight across the slopes, the subtle shimmer of heat rising from the earth. Once the range was ready, he settled behind the rifle again. No dramatic speech, no display of confidence, just patience. Ethan Brooks watched from nearby, barely aware of the phone vibrating in his pocket. Messages were arriving one after another from people far above his pay grade. He ignored every one of them. Right now, only the firing line mattered. Walter exhaled slowly. His finger rested against the trigger. The rifle remained perfectly still. Several seconds passed. Then more. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire range seemed suspended in anticipation. Finally, Walter squeezed the trigger. The sound rolled across the valley and disappeared into the distance. Then came the waiting. At 2,300 yards, time felt different. Every eye locked onto the target. The spotters stared through their optics. The officers on the observation platform leaned forward. Mercer's jaw tightened. 1 second passed. Then 2. Then 3. The silence became almost unbearable. For seconds. 5. And then it came. A sharp metallic ring drifted back across the valley. Clear. Distinct. Undeniable. The steel target had been struck. Nobody reacted immediately. The sound seemed too improbable to process. For several heartbeats, the entire range remained frozen. Then a spotter lowered his scope and looked up with wide eyes. Another checked his equipment as if it might somehow be wrong. Ethan simply stared at Walter. Mercer's mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. The old man himself showed no excitement, no celebration, no satisfaction. He calmly lifted the bolt, checked the rifle, and rested it across his knees, as though what had just happened was entirely ordinary. Around him, dozens of Marines stood in complete silence. And somewhere beyond Camp Hawthorne, vehicles were already moving toward the range. The silence following the impact seemed to stretch forever. No one on the range spoke. No one moved. The metallic ring from the distant target had faded into the afternoon air, yet its effect remained. Walter Hayes rested the rifle across his knees and looked toward the valley as if nothing unusual had happened. Around him, Marines who had spent years mastering their craft struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Then a new sound drifted across Camp Hawthorne. Engines. Several black vehicles appeared on the access road leading toward the range. Heads turned immediately. Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Mercer frowned. The vehicles moved quickly, throwing trails of dust behind them as they crossed the base. When they stopped near the observation platform, uniformed officers stepped out first. Then a colonel, then another. Conversations that had begun to return died instantly. Ethan Brooks felt his phone vibrate again. This time he looked down. The newest message contained only 4 words. Hold position. General en route. Ethan stared at the screen. His pulse quickened. Across the range, Walter remained seated beside the rifle, completely unaffected by the sudden arrival of senior leadership. The colonel crossed the firing line with determined steps. His eyes never left the old man. Behind him, officers followed in complete silence. Mercer instinctively straightened his posture. Something far bigger than a marksmanship demonstration was unfolding. The colonel stopped several feet from Walter. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the colonel smiled. Not the polite smile of an officer greeting a civilian. The smile of someone who had just found a living piece of history. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly, "it is an honor to see you again." Every Marine on the range exchanged confused looks. Walter slowly rose to his feet. "Colonel." The simple reply carried the familiarity of old acquaintances. Before anyone could speak further, another vehicle arrived. This one caused an immediate reaction among the officers. Doors opened. Conversations stopped. A brigadier general stepped out and walked directly toward Walter Hayes. The range fell completely silent. Ethan watched the general approach, then come to a stop in front of the old man. For a brief moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Then the general stood at attention. The gesture hit the Marines harder than any speech could have. "Sir," the general said respectfully, "we have been looking for you for years." Walter shook his head slightly. "I was not hiding." A few officers laughed softly. The tension dissolved. Mercer stood frozen. Everything he thought he knew about the quiet old man had collapsed in a single afternoon. The general glanced toward the distant target, then toward the weathered rifle. Still carrying the same one. Walter nodded. "Never found a reason to replace it." The general smiled. "Some things do not need replacing." The Marines listened carefully as fragments of the truth emerged. Stories whispered through training schools. Records discussed in classrooms. Achievements most of them had assumed belonged to legends rather than real people. Walter never corrected anyone. Never volunteered details. Never sought recognition. He simply stood quietly while others spoke. As the sun began its slow descent beyond the ridges, the officers eventually prepared to leave. Walter picked up the old rifle case and started walking toward the parking area. Mercer stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes." Walter stopped and looked back. The gunnery sergeant hesitated before speaking. "Thank you." Walter considered the words for a moment and gave a small nod. "The range was teaching all day," he said. "You just needed to listen." Then he continued walking. No applause followed. No ceremony. No grand farewell. Just the fading sound of boots on gravel as the old Marine disappeared beneath the golden light of the evening. Long after he was gone, nobody on the range moved. They simply stood there looking across the valley, understanding something they had not understood that morning. Skill fades. Equipment changes. Technology advances. But experience, earned honestly over a lifetime, leaves an echo that never truly disappears.